Playing with Fire by Isles of Woe, a fan work, based on the All for the Game series by Nora Sakavic. Chapter 1. As far as Carson James was concerned, the most beautiful sound in the world wasn't music or the first drops of rain after a long drought. Nothing compared to the echoing slam of a ball signaling a hard-won goal seconds before the end of a game. Carson couldn't care less about the world when that sound hit her ears. For all she knew, nothing but the court existed in the silence between that echoing thud and the final buzzer. "And the game goes to the Heritage Eagles!" The announcer's voice roared over the makeshift court, rising with the noise of the crowd into the night sky. "Better luck next time, Pirates!" Carson's fingers went numb around her racket. She'd been so focused on playing the game that she hadn't thought about the scores since halftime. A buzzing in her ears drowned out the endgame commotion that swirled around her as she stood frozen, staring at the away goal. They'd lost. She'd lost. It was her senior year, and her team had just been booted from the season. This couldn't be her last game. There was no way. It was just a run-of-the-mill match. The Pirates weren't even playing against a rival school, but this simple loss changed everything. The teams lined up to exchange handshakes at the half-court line. Carson went through the motions in a daze, moving like a puppet on a string, unseeing, unfeeling. She'd barely had enough awareness to remove her gloves. Her legs carried her back into the school's locker rooms, leaving her soul somewhere on the empty court as she followed the rest of her team. She didn't join them at the lockers, though. Instead, she found herself crumpled in a stall at the foot of a toilet, staring into the yawning mouth that reeked of not quite clean porcelain. Before she knew what was happening, she was spilling her guts and shuddering with the effort. That was her last game. The season was over. Carson could never play Exie again. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it. Exie was her thing. It was her escape, her life. Carson was nothing without it. Deep down, she knew that the end of her last season was approaching, regardless of tonight's outcome. But she hadn't let herself think about what that would mean for her. Carson needed the promise of one more game to keep her going. If she'd even acknowledged the last 3 months standing between her and graduation without the safety net of the court, she was going to crack. Of course this would end. It had to. But Carson couldn't seem to come to terms with the fact that that end was now. A firm knock rattled the door of the bathroom stall behind her, bringing the edges of Carson's vision back into focus as she found her body again. "Carson?" Coach Valdez called from the other side. "You okay in there?" Carson cringed at the sound of her coach's voice. It was humiliating, being found heaving on the bathroom floor. She scrambled to her feet awkwardly. Moving in such a tiny space with all of her gear on and a toilet full of vomit in front of her wasn't easy. It took Carson 2 tries to find her voice, and her words came out in a bubbly rasp. Yeah, hang on." She choked, grimacing at the way her voice sounded. She cleared her throat before fumbling with the latch and opening the stall door. "What?" Carson said. It was all she could manage to push out of her tight throat, and Carson tried not to wince at her short response. Her mother would be mortified by her behavior. Hell, she'd probably sit Carson down and force her to rehearse 3 different variations that would have been more acceptable. It was a weight off Carson's shoulders, just knowing that her mother wasn't there to hear her. Coach Valdez gave Carson a soft look. She'd long since given up on trying to get Carson help, but it was clear to Carson that Valdez would never quite manage to hide her discomfort with Carson's habit. Carson would never call it that. But how could anyone know that her propensity for finding herself at the mercy of her roiling stomach was at best involuntary and at worst an inescapable nightmare? Carson did her best to push down the hot flare of shame that sparked in her stomach at the thought of anyone catching her in this state. especially her coach. "I'm glad I found you," Valdez said. "I was worried you'd left with the rest of the team." In 3 years, Carson had never stayed with the group. Valdez knew that. But she'd never given up hope that her top striker would one day connect with another person. "Did you need something?" Carson said, doing her best to sound normal. "No, Coach Valdez. She was not an unstable wreck with a penchant for losing her lunch. Why ever would you think that? Actually, there's someone here to see you." It took Carson a second to understand what her coach was saying. When her brain finally caught up to her ears, Carson could only stand and stare in silent horror. There were very few people who would ever seek her out, and only one who would actually go out of their way to do so. If Carson's mother was here, the end of the season was the least of Carson's worries. She searched Valdez's face for any indication that her worst nightmare had finally snuck up on her, but it was no use. Her coach held the same cautiously pleasant expression she often used when dealing with Carson, as if she was trying to placate a skittish stray. Carson did her best to move her numb lips into something like a smile. "Thanks. I'll be out in a minute." Valdez didn't seem to notice the meltdown roaring behind Carson's eyes. She just gave her a small smile and patted Carson on the shoulder before heading back toward the lockers. Carson waited until her coach was out of sight before quickly stomping on the lever to flush the toilet. She stumbled out of her stall and over to the sinks across the way. Barely making it, Carson had to catch herself on one of the basins. It hurt to breathe. The world was growing fuzzy again, and Carson had to tighten her hands on the sink to keep the tremors from shaking all the way up her arms. Carson was done for, and she knew it all the way down to her bones. Her mother was there. She had to be. Of course, Valdez didn't know how disastrous this was. Carson had made absolutely sure that she'd never met Amelia James, and her mother was hell-bent on keeping up appearances in public. She wouldn't just storm in here like your garden variety Karen. No, she'd be waiting for Carson in the locker room, politely smiling and pretending that she couldn't smell the sweat and unwashed exy gear around her. What happened after she dragged Carson home was a different story. Exy had been Carson's secret for 3 years. It was the one thing that was truly hers. Her last season was over. She was far from safe. Carson's eyes burned, but she refused to let herself cry. If her mother saw a single tear, she would pounce on that weakness and exploit it for all it was worth. And so, Carson stared into her reflection, standing pale-faced in front of her. She locked her gaze onto her eyes, took one breath in, and straightened. If her mother was waiting for her, then Carson would meet her with fists swinging. Carson's stomach still churned with the need to throw up. She probably would, once she was alone, but on the outside she was cool as ice. At least she hoped that was how she looked. She could almost see her mother now, stick straight and poised, out of place in the high school locker room with her perfect blouse and crisply ironed slacks, immaculate makeup and clean sandy hair at odds with the peeling paint and juvenile graffiti surrounding her. But when Carson rounded the corner and caught sight of the scene before her, her brain short-circuited. Her mother was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a woman sat straddling one of the benches. She was lean and toned, with warm, dark skin and black curls buzzed almost to her scalp. She looked so casually confident in jeans and a black halter, and Carson couldn't deny that she had the best damn shoulders Carson had ever seen. As Carson approached, the woman stood, giving her a smile that was all hard edges, but that contained none of the unfriendliness one would expect from such sharpness. "Carson James?" she said, holding out a hand. It was only half a question, as if she knew exactly who Carson was and was only asking as a formality. "That's my name," Carson said, blinking to regain some of her bearings. Her gaze flicked from the woman's hand to her eyes and back again before she realized, belatedly, that she was meant to shake it. Carson had to fight to keep her face from reddening, and she wasn't sure she quite accomplished it. The woman's grip was calloused and firm. "My name is Danielle Wilds. You played a great game out there today." Carson dropped the woman's, Danielle's hand and resisted the urge to start fiddling with her armor. "But we lost." Wild's expression hardened at that. "The score does not necessarily determine the player," she practically scolded. Carson just stood there, unsure of what to do next. She could feel her shoulders tightening up and her fingers itched to grab hold of something, anything, but she stayed where she was. The woman had called herself Danielle Wilds. The name sounded familiar to Carson, but she couldn't get a grip on where she knew it from. Her mind had been through the ringer tonight, and it was starting to fail her. Coach Valdez took advantage of the pause and spoke up. "Carson has been the best striker on my line since this school began its XE program." Carson fought to keep her gaze from dropping to the floor at the praise. Valdez knew she didn't do well with that sort of thing, but she almost never spared Carson the courtesy of praising her behind her back. "You certainly have promise," Danielle said, not taking her eyes off of Carson. "What are your plans after this year? You're graduating in May, yes?" Carson nodded. Her vocal cords seized at the mere thought of plans after high school. What was she supposed to say? That she planned to be perfect? Get the best job, find success, and live on her own without any support, all without knowing what school she was even going to? She didn't even know what the hell she wanted to do. Not that she would ever actually be given a choice. I hadn't actually thought that far. Danielle raised an eyebrow. "It's March." Carson's heart sank. She knew it was late, but her mother had made it very clear that it was her job to make those decisions, not Carson's. "Yeah," she said, losing the fight and staring hard at the dirty tiles beneath her feet. "I know." "The reason I'm asking," Danielle said, not letting up on her scrutiny, "is because I came here with an offer." Carson looked up at that. She was beginning to place where she'd heard Danielle's name before, and she wasn't sure if the idea filled her with terror or the first glow of hope she'd felt in years. Danielle reached behind her to the bench that she'd been sitting on, picking up a thick folder. "You see, I'm an assistant coach at Palmetto State University. Our line is short a striker sub, and I think you might be exactly what our team needs." Palmetto State. Now that was a name Carson didn't have to strain to remember. Anyone who was even remotely interested in XE had heard of that school enough times for it to be burned into their memories. They were infamous, with non-game specific reports on the team overshadowing even the professional league's news at times. Even Carson knew who they were, and she had to sneak any scraps of XE information from the one outdated computer available to students in the school library, which could only be used for 15 minutes at a time. "The Foxes," Carson breathed. This was starting to feel like some sort of cruel joke. "So you've heard of us," Wild said, sounding mildly impressed. She shouldn't have been surprised. Now that she'd mentioned what school she was from, Carson finally remembered where she'd heard the woman's name. Danielle Wilds had captained the Foxes for 4 years before she graduated. With a position like that, she'd have been intimately familiar with the stranglehold her team had on American sports journalism. The Foxes were a honeypot for any journalist looking to make their break into the sports scene. Their coach, David Wymack, had made a name for himself by only recruiting athletes from broken homes and rough backgrounds. The idea, he'd been quoted saying, was to give another chance to those who wouldn't otherwise get one. It was nice, in theory. In practice, however, bringing together fractured isolationists, volatile junkies, and talented rejects resulted in a team that was wholly resistant to the concept of teamwork. From year to year, the Foxes' rankings ranged from poor to abysmal, and any successes they'd garnered were widely considered as flukes. The team had only kept its Class 1 ranking because the ERC, the XE Rules and Regulations Committee, and the NCAA would have been insane to give up such a huge publicity cash cow. Almost all of the news surrounding the Foxes was less about XE and more about team drama. Frankly, the public couldn't get enough. Carson, on the other hand, often wished they would just fade into obscurity already. Every report and article detailing fights and speculating on team dynamics only served to drown out what actually mattered. XE. What Carson couldn't understand was why the Foxes wanted her. Sure, she'd been playing for 3 years now, since the Anglewood Pirates had started their XE program, but she was far from being a Class 1 athlete. From what she could remember, the Foxes were stationed on the East Coast, hundreds of miles away from Carson's little high school in the middle of Colorado. There was no way she was good enough to even be a blip on their radar. And to think that she qualified as a candidate for Palmetto State's halfway house team? Carson couldn't keep from glancing over at Coach Valdez and wondering what on earth she could have told Danielle to make her think that Carson fit that criteria. I'm not sure I'd be up to your standards. Even with her reservations, Carson kicked herself for giving Wilds a reason to drop her from consideration and leave. Danielle gave Carson an almost pitying look. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think you'd add something to our lineup, she said flatly, almost as if she was scolding Carson for her doubt. Until now, Carson hadn't cared how good of a player she was. She couldn't afford to think about that. She just needed something to keep her going day after day, and XE was that thing. It couldn't have been anything other than temporary. Playing XE had meant keeping an atomic secret from the watchful gaze of her mother. No matter how much she wished it would never end, Carson's time on the court was limited. As far as she was concerned, that time was borrowed, and now Carson had to pay her dues. If what Danielle was offering was real, if Carson was truly good enough to play for the Foxes, then she wouldn't have to lose her lifeline. Carson couldn't deny how much she wanted this chance to play XE, and not just in secret with the clock incessantly counting down her meager time behind her eyelids. Just the thought of going collegiate, maybe even professional, it made Carson feel, well, it hurt. All that want, that need to be free to do the one thing she loved. This opportunity was like a knife between her ribs. Carson knew she could never have that life. No matter how hard she tried, how determined she was, how far she got from Colorado and her mother and her responsibility, she would never, ever be allowed to have that life. Danielle handed the folder over, and the bright orange fox paw printed on the front sent a fresh stab of pain through Carson's lungs. There was her name, boldly scrawled across the top in permanent marker. "You're a great player," Danielle said. Carson looked up to see that fierce gaze locked entirely on her. "You could be even better with us." Carson swallowed. Her mouth was as dry as if she'd filled it with sand. Her mind had completely stopped working. "How do you know?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. Danielle glanced over at Coach Valdez, her expression softening slightly. "I've been in contact with your coach here. She guesses you have more endurance than every other athlete at this school. I've also been told that you're stubborn. You don't know when to quit, even when stepping away is the best option. From what I saw on the court this afternoon, I'm inclined to believe her." Carson only stared at her. Wilds continued. "What you need is a team that can match your intensity and balance you out. Refusing to quit is one thing, but if it means bashing your head against an immovable wall over and over, then that's just the definition of insanity. Say what you want about my Foxes, they won't ever stand still." Carson wasn't sure how to respond. Introspection wasn't her strong suit, she knew, but she had done just fine with her mediocre high school team until now. Except they'd lost tonight, and Carson hadn't even lifted her head out of the game enough to see that the last goal was only ever going to be too little too late. Is this what Wilds was talking about? Could Carson not only continue to play XE, but be even better on the court than she was now? This all sounded too good to be true, and a not insignificant part of her still couldn't shake the idea that she just didn't fit the bill. "I'm not," Carson began, though she couldn't find the words to match what was nagging at her so incessantly. Somehow, Danielle seemed to understand the meaning behind that silence even more than Carson did. "Your coach," Wilds said carefully. "She suspects something is going on in your home life that you are not letting on about. Your brother was arrested last year, yes?" Her words were gentle, but they landed like a sledgehammer against Carson's sternum. She snapped to attention. "That had nothing to do with me," she said, cringing at how loud her voice rang in the near, empty locker room. She didn't want to think about the look her mother would have given her for getting defensive. She wanted even less to think about how she would react to her brother's arrest being brought up in any conversation. Danielle raised her hands, palms forward as if trying to get her to back down. "I wasn't saying that it did," she said, voice firm but calm. "But I've also been told about the panic attacks. Valdez tells me that you're constantly hiding out in here. Always alone. Your mother never comes to games." Danielle paused for a second, studying Carson. Carson didn't dare react. If her mother knew that not one but 3 people had the impression that their family wasn't absolutely perfect, she'd be on Carson's ass about it for sure. Valdez, who'd been standing off to the side and letting the conversation play out before her, chose this moment to step in. "I worry, Carson, that something is eating you alive," she said, giving Carson an apologetic look. Carson knew she had to have told Danielle something to get her to come all the way out here, but even knowing this didn't keep Carson from feeling anything short of betrayal. Those were her problems. No one should have been able to share them except for her. Carson could feel herself slipping away from her body again. Her mind disconnected, and she stared at a point between the 2 women, unable to make herself look either in the eye. Danielle didn't let Carson fade out completely. She grabbed Carson's shoulder, and even through the padding of her gear, the woman's grip was firm and grounding. She dipped her head, forcing Carson to look her in the eyes. "For the record, Wymack and I agree." She gave Carson's shoulder a small but rough shake when she tried to drop her gaze back to her shoes. "I think," Danielle continued, "that you need an escape, and this is the perfect out." She wasn't wrong. Exie had been an escape. It had been Carson's one and only escape for the last 3 years. But she knew it had to come to an end. Tonight's game had sealed that fate for her. She was done. There was absolutely no way Carson could convince her mother to let her go to Palmetto State. If she went, she'd be all the way in South Carolina, so far that her mother's control couldn't possibly reach her. She'd be furious. And if she found out Carson was playing Exie, well, Carson didn't have a death wish. Her mother would force her to defer from college for sure. She'd likely ground her for months. She'd definitely try to re-educate her on how to be the perfect daughter. Carson would be making her look bad not just to the neighborhood or her teachers, but to the whole country. And yet, here was Danielle. Here was Carson's out. She could actually do this. Carson looked between Coach Valdez and Danielle, worrying her lips so hard between her teeth she tasted blood. "Do I have to tell my mom?" Danielle raised her eyebrow again, and Carson secretly wished she had the ability to do the same. "You're legal, aren't you?" Carson's age had nothing to do with it. She had lived her entire life under her mother's thumb. Nothing had ever been done without her mother knowing about it, and more often than not, it was her mother making the decisions for her. Things had only gotten worse the more her brothers acted out. Not that she placed nearly the same expectations on them as she did on Carson. Carson nodded, not trusting herself to say anything else. "Will she be a problem?" Danielle pushed. "We can fly you out after graduation if that's the case. We've had teammates stay over the summer before, and I can arrange for summer housing if that's what you need." Carson drew her thumb across the edge of the folder, staring at the paw that almost glowed against the white background. She knew the right thing to do was to say no, but now that Danielle was here, she didn't think she had the strength. Carson had suffered the thought of losing Exie forever less than an hour before, and it nearly killed her. She let this offer slip through her fingers. She thought she might actually stop breathing on the spot. The thought that her mother still didn't know about her illicit activities filled her with so much relief she feared her legs would give out on her at any second. Carson's decision had already been made, and she knew it. "Okay," she said, but barely any sound came out. Danielle tilted closer to her, that sharp smile threatening to return to her lips. "I'm sorry, what was that?" "Where do I sign?" Carson asked, forcing her voice to be stronger than she thought currently possible. Danielle's smile cracked her face open in an instant, and she held out her hand for Carson to shake once again. "Good girl." This has been Chapter 1 of Playing with Fire, and all for the game's story. If you liked what you heard today, feel free to click the subscribe button, and please, please, please share this with your friends, especially the ones who enjoy the Foxhole Court. I made this for you guys. If you want to read any more of my writing, you can find me as Isles of Woe on AO3, or you can click the link in the doobly-doo and it will take you straight to my page. I try to update this story every 2 weeks, so stay tuned for the next installment. And I would love to hear from you, so comment if you'd like, and again, please share with your friends. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to this, and I hope to see you guys soon. Bye!